Captain Lauren Hayes checked the navigation screens for the 5th time in 10 minutes as her ship the Horizon moved deeper into space that no human had ever explored before, and her hands were steady, but her heart beat faster with each passing moment because every sensor was screaming warnings about the territory they were entering. The crew of 12 had been traveling for 6 months from Earth on a mission to find new worlds and make contact with alien species. But the region they were approaching now had a reputation that made even the bravest explorers turn back because this was the domain of Empress Kira Nightshade, who ruled over 40 star systems with absolute power. Lieutenant Maya Foster stood at the communications station with her dark hair pulled back tight, and her brown eyes focused on the display that showed nothing but empty space ahead. Though everyone knew that emptiness was deceiving because the IDI Empress had technology that could hide entire fleets from detection until it was too late to escape. Commander Troy Bennett worked at the tactical station running calculations about their chances of survival if they encountered hostile forces, and the numbers were not encouraging because intelligence reports said the Empress had destroyed 7 alien civilizations that tried to invade her space, and she did it without losing a single battle. Lauren had argued with Earth Command for 3 weeks before getting permission for this mission, because the politicians wanted to avoid the Empress entirely. But the captain believed that humanity needed allies in this dangerous galaxy, and the most powerful ruler in known space would be the best ally they could find if they could just make peaceful contact. The problem was that nobody had ever made peaceful contact with Kira Nightshade, because she appeared without warning to destroy threats and then vanished back into her hidden realm, where sensors could not track her ships or locate her home world, no matter how hard anyone tried. Stories about the Empress said she was an elf woman who had lived for over 300 years and had mastered technologies that seemed like magic to other species, and she traveled with 2 massive dragons that were just as deadly as their mistress, because they could breathe fire hot enough to melt battle cruisers or freeze entire stations with ice that never melted. Maya turned from her station and reported that they had just crossed the boundary markers that warned ships to turn back or face immediate destruction. And her voice was calm, but everyone could hear the tension underneath, because crossing that line meant they were committed now and there was no safe way to retreat if things went wrong. The bridge fell silent except for the soft hum of the engines and the beeping of various monitors as the crew waited to see what would happen next, because some alien species reported that the Empress destroyed intruders within seconds of crossing her borders, while others said she watched and waited to judge the intentions of those who dared enter her domain. Lauren stood from her command chair and straightened her uniform as she prepared to record a message that would broadcast on all frequencies, explaining that humans came in peace and wanted to establish diplomatic relations with the Empress because honesty seemed like the best approach when dealing with someone who had the power to read minds, according to some of the more wild rumors. Before she could begin recording, the lights on the bridge flickered and every screen went dark for 3 seconds. That felt like hours before the displays came back online, showing something that made the entire crew gasp in shock and amazement, because the main view screen now showed the interior of a throne room that seemed to exist in a different dimension. The throne itself was carved from a single massive crystal that pulsed with inner light, and sitting upon it was a woman whose beauty was matched only by the dangerous energy that radiated from her like heat from a star, as she wore armor that seemed to be made of liquid starlight that flowed across her body in patterns that hurt to look at directly. Empress Kira Nightshade had violet eyes that seemed to see through the hull of the ship and into the souls of every crew member as she studied them with an expression that mixed curiosity with the cold calculation of a predator deciding whether prey was worth hunting or should be ignored. Flanking her throne on both sides were 2 dragons so large that their true size was impossible to judge from the holographic display, but their presence filled the screen with raw power that made the air in the bridge feel heavy and thick as one dragon had scales like molten metal that glowed red and orange, while the other had scales of pure white crystal that sparkled with frost. The red dragon, called Ember according to the intelligence files, lifted its massive head and breathed out a stream of smoke that sparkled with tiny stars like a miniature galaxy, while the white dragon, named Frost, spread wings that seemed to be made of living ice that created patterns of impossible beauty in the air. Lauren felt her throat go dry as she realized this was the moment that would determine the fate of not just her crew, but possibly all of humanity. Because if the Empress decided humans were a threat, then Earth itself might face destruction from weapons that could shatter planets, and the captain had no illusions about their ability to fight back against such overwhelming force. The Empress leaned forward slightly, and her movement was graceful like a dancer, but also predatory like a hunting cat, as she rested one hand on the arm of her throne, while her other hand moved to touch a sword that hung at her side, and that weapon was legendary across the galaxy as Voidbreaker, the blade that had ended empires and killed gods, according to the stories. When Kira spoke, her voice seemed to come from everywhere at once as it filled the bridge with a sound that was beautiful and terrible at the same time, like listening to a symphony played during a thunderstorm, and every word carried weight that pressed down on the humans like physical force. "We have been watching your species for many years," the Empress said, as her dragons shifted positions behind her throne with movements that were synchronized perfectly, as if they shared one mind across 3 bodies. "And I find you interesting in ways that other species have not been." Lauren forced herself to step forward even though every instinct screamed at her to run or hide, because she knew that showing fear to a predator like the Empress would be the worst possible response, and the captain had not come this far to fail. Because of cowardice, when courage might be the key to survival. The captain opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak, the Empress raised one hand in a gesture that seemed casual, but caused every system on the horizon to freeze in place, as if time itself had stopped flowing normally, and the crew could only watch helplessly as their powerful visitor demonstrated just how completely she controlled the situation. The temperature on the bridge dropped by 15 degrees in just seconds, as frost began forming on the edges of the computer screens, and Maya wrapped her arms around herself, trying not to shiver, while Troy checked his tactical readings only to find that every weapon system on the ship had been disabled without any visible cause or method that their sensors could detect. Lauren felt the cold seep into her bones, but she refused to show weakness as she met the Empress's violet gaze through the view screen, and something passed between them in that moment of locked eyes that felt like a challenge and a question combined. Because Kira seemed to be testing the human captain in ways that went beyond simple threats or displays of power. "Your species fascinates me because you are so fragile," the Empress said as she stood from her throne with movements that seemed to defy gravity, as her armor flowed like water around her perfect form. "And yet you venture into the most dangerous parts of space with nothing but curiosity and hope to protect you from the darkness that waits between the stars." The dragons moved with their mistress as Ember stretched its massive wings, causing the temperature to spike upward until the frost melted from the screens, while Frost breathed out a cloud of crystalline ice particles that sparkled in the strange light of the throne room, creating a display that was both beautiful and threatening in its implications. Lauren found her voice despite the fear that threatened to choke her words, and she spoke with as much confidence as she could gather, saying that humans explored because they believed the universe was meant to be understood and shared, not hidden, behind walls of fear and isolation, even when the exploring was dangerous and could lead to death. The Empress tilted her head slightly as if considering this response, while her hand never left the hilt of Voidbreaker, and the legendary sword seemed to hum with barely contained energy that made reality itself ripple around the blade in patterns that hurt to perceive because they suggested dimensions and forces that human science had not yet discovered or named. "Many species have given me similar answers," Kira said, as she began walking toward the view screen, which meant she was somehow moving closer to the humans, despite the vast distance that separated their ships, and her voice carried notes of sadness, mixed with bitter amusement as she continued speaking about the countless encounters she had experienced over her long life. She explained that most species claimed to seek peace and understanding, but when they saw her power, they either tried to steal it for themselves or fled in terror because they could not accept that someone could be both beautiful and deadly at the same time, and their failure to see past surface appearances always disappointed her because it meant she remained alone in her superiority. Troy whispered urgently to Lauren that their engines were coming back online, and they might have a chance to jump away, but the captain shook her head, knowing that running would only confirm the Empress's low opinion of other species. And besides, their jump drive would never activate faster than Kira could destroy them if she decided they were not worth keeping alive. Maya reported that she was receiving data packets from the Empress's ship, and the information included star charts of regions no human had ever seen, along with technical specifications for technologies that were centuries beyond what Earth scientists had achieved, and the gesture seemed almost like a gift, though everyone knew it could also be a trap. The Empress stopped her approach when she was close enough to the view screen that her face filled the entire display, and her violet eyes seemed to look directly into Lauren's soul as she studied the captain with an intensity that felt like being examined under a microscope by someone who understood every weakness and fear that humans tried to hide from themselves and others. "I have destroyed civilizations that threatened my people," Kira said, and her voice was soft but carried steel underneath the gentle tone, as her dragons flanked her with ember on her right breathing smoke that formed shapes of dying worlds while frost on her left created ice sculptures of shattered fleets in the air behind them. The Empress continued explaining that she had fought wars that lasted decades and commanded fleets of thousands of ships against enemies who sought to enslave or destroy everything she protected, and she had won every battle through superior strategy and overwhelming force until her very name became a warning that kept most species far from her borders. But victory after victory had left her isolated at the peak of power with no equals to challenge her mind and no companions who could understand what it meant to carry the weight of 40 worlds on her shoulders alone, because everyone either worshipped her as a goddess or feared her as a monster, and neither reaction allowed for genuine connection. Lauren listened to this confession and realized that the deadliest being in the galaxy was also one of the loneliest, and that beneath the armor and weapons and legendary reputation was someone who yearned for something that power could not provide, which was simple, honest friendship with another being who saw past the surface to the person underneath. The captain made a decision that would either save her crew or doom them all as she spoke directly to the Empress, not as a subordinate addressing a superior, but as one leader talking to another. And she said that humans understood loneliness because they had spent centuries thinking they were alone in the universe before discovering alien life. She explained that humanity had learned to value connection over conquest and conversation over conflict, because being alone in the darkness was a fate worse than death for a social species that needed community and shared experience to find meaning in existence, and perhaps the Empress had forgotten that power without purpose was just empty force. Kira's expression shifted through several emotions too quickly to track as anger and surprise, and something that might have been hope flickered across her perfect features before settling into a look of intense curiosity that made her lean even closer to the screen, as if she could reach through the display to touch the human who dared speak to her with such directness. The dragons responded to their mistress's emotional state, as Ember roared with a sound that shook the horizon, despite the distance between ships, while Frost created a blizzard of ice crystals that swirled around the throne room in patterns that seemed almost like dancing or celebration. Though everyone knew these creatures could switch from beauty to destruction in seconds. "You speak boldly for someone whose ship I could vaporize with a thought," the Empress said. But there was no threat in her tone now, only a kind of testing quality, as if she wanted to see how far Lauren would push this unexpected dynamic between warrior ruler and explorer captain who represented very different approaches to surviving in a dangerous galaxy. Lauren smiled despite the fear still present in her chest, and she replied that bold speech seemed appropriate when talking to someone who could destroy them anyway, so they might as well be honest and direct, rather than wasting time with false courtesy that fooled nobody and accomplished nothing except delay the inevitable. The Empress laughed, and the sound was like crystal bells mixed with thunder as it filled the bridge with a joy that seemed almost forgotten, as if Kira had not experienced genuine amusement in so long that the emotion felt strange and new even, though it came from deep within her ancient soul. And the dragons responded by creating a display of fire and ice that danced together in impossible harmony. "I like you, human captain," the Empress said as her hand finally left the hilt of Voidbreaker, and she crossed her arms over her chest in a posture that was less threatening and more relaxed, though everyone knew she could still kill them all without needing any weapon beyond her own abilities and the power that radiated from her like heat from a furnace. Lauren felt some of the tension drain from her shoulders, but she remained alert because dealing with someone as powerful and unpredictable as Kira meant never letting your guard down completely, even when things seemed to be going well, since the situation could change in an instant if the Empress decided she was bored or offended by something. Maya turned from her station and reported in a quiet voice that the data packets they had received contained not just star charts and technology, but also historical records of the Empress's battles and diplomatic encounters over 3 centuries. And the information was incredibly valuable but also deeply personal, as if Kira was sharing her life story with these strangers she had just met. Troy studied his tactical display and noticed that while their weapons remained offline, their defensive shields had been restored to full power, and their engines were functioning normally, which suggested that the Empress was giving them the ability to defend or flee if necessary. Though everyone understood that such gestures were meaningless against someone who could disable their entire ship with a thought. The Empress gestured with one elegant hand, And suddenly she was no longer on the view screen but standing physically on the bridge of the horizon, as if she had teleported across the vast distance of space, or perhaps had been projecting herself all along and only now chose to reveal her true presence among the humans who had dared enter her domain. Her dragons accompanied her, but they appeared as swirling masses of energy rather than their full physical forms, because the bridge was too small to contain creatures whose wingspans could measure hundreds of meters, and Ember manifested as a sphere of red and orange flame that floated near the ceiling, while Frost became a cloud of sparkling ice crystals that drifted through the air. The crew scrambled backward instinctively as the most dangerous being in known space materialized in their midst. But Lauren held her ground, even as her heart hammered in her chest, because running would accomplish nothing, and showing courage might be the only thing keeping them alive as the Empress studied her surroundings with eyes that missed nothing. "Your ship is small and cramped," Kira observed as she walked around the bridge examining the various stations and equipment with genuine curiosity, while her armor seemed to adjust itself to avoid touching anything, as if she was being careful not to damage the primitive human technology through careless contact. She paused at Maya's communication station and touched the display with one finger, causing the screen to light up with information that should have been encrypted and inaccessible. But the Empress scrolled through Earth's communication logs as easily as if she had built the systems herself, and her expression showed amusement at what she found. "You have been sending reports back to your home world describing me as a potential threat," the Empress said without anger or accusation in her tone. Just simple observation of facts, as she continued reading through classified files that were supposed to be secure and protected by the best encryption Earth scientists could design. Maya looked terrified as she glanced at Lauren for guidance because having the Empress discover their intelligence reports and threat assessments seemed like exactly the kind of thing that could turn this encounter deadly in seconds. But the captain remained calm and nodded for Maya to speak truthfully. The lieutenant found her voice and explained that describing potential threats was standard procedure for exploration missions, because Earth Command needed accurate information to make decisions about how to approach new contacts, and the reports were not meant to be insulting, just realistic assessments based on available information about the Empress's military capabilities. Kira turned from the display and smiled at Maya with an expression that mixed approval and sadness as she said that at least humans were honest about their fears, unlike some species who pretended friendship while plotting betrayal. And she appreciated the straightforward approach even if it meant being classified as dangerous. The Empress moved to where Troy stood at tactical, and she studied his calculations about their chances of survival with interest, before laughing softly and pointing out several errors in his assumptions about her weapons range and destructive capacity, because the real numbers were far worse than anything Earth's intelligence had estimated. Troy went pale as the Empress casually explained that she could destroy their ship from 10 times the distance his calculations showed, and her reaction time was measured in microseconds, not the seconds his tactical computer assumed, which meant any plan based on dodging or defending against her attacks was completely useless. "But I am not going to destroy you," Kira said as she turned back to Lauren, and her violet eyes held something that looked almost like hope, mixed with challenge, as she continued speaking in a voice that had dropped to something more intimate and personal than the commanding tone she had used earlier. She explained that in 300 years of ruling and fighting, she had never met anyone who spoke to her the way Lauren did, with that combination of respect and directness that acknowledged her power without being paralyzed by fear of it, and that quality was rare enough to be precious because most beings either cowered or tried to manipulate. The dragons responded to their mistress's emotional state as Ember's flames burned brighter and warmer, creating a comfortable heat that drove away the chill, while Frost's crystals formed patterns in the air that looked almost like words or symbols, though no one could read the meaning behind the beautiful shapes. Lauren realized that this entire encounter had been a test from the moment they crossed the boundary markers into the Empress's territory, and Kira had been evaluating not just their technology or military capability, but their character and how they responded to overwhelming power, and apparently humanity had passed by choosing honesty over deception. The captain asked what would happen next, because they had come seeking an alliance between humanity and the Empress's empire, and while the meeting had not gone as expected, it seemed like there might be possibilities for cooperation if both sides could find common ground beyond simple fear or domination. Kira walked closer to Lauren until they stood face to face with only a meter of space between them. And at this distance, the captain could see that the Empress's eyes held centuries of weariness and loneliness that no amount of power or victory could erase, because being untouchable meant being alone in ways that most beings could never understand. "I will consider your proposal for alliance," the Empress said as her hand moved to rest on Voidbreaker again. But this time the gesture seemed more like habit than threat, as she studied Lauren with an intensity that felt like being weighed and measured against some standard that only Kira knew. She explained that she would need to see more of humanity before making a decision about formal diplomatic relations, because one ship and crew was not enough evidence to judge an entire species, and she proposed that Lauren and her crew should visit her homeworld as guests so the Empress could observe how they behaved in different situations. The offer was both invitation and command, as everyone understood that refusing would insult the Empress and potentially end any chance of alliance, but accepting meant putting themselves completely in her power on her territory where no one could help them if things went wrong, and the decision carried enormous weight. Lauren looked at her crew and saw fear in their eyes, but also determination, because they had come on this mission knowing the risks, and they trusted their captain to make the right choice, even when that choice was difficult or dangerous, and the crew nodded their support for whatever decision she made. The captain turned back to face Empress Kira and spoke with confidence that surprised even herself as she accepted the invitation to visit the Empress's homeworld, because humans did not shy away from opportunities even when those opportunities came wrapped in danger and uncertainty that would make most species retreat to safety. The Empress smiled, and this time the expression reached her eyes, creating a warmth that transformed her face from coldly beautiful to genuinely lovely, as if Lauren's acceptance had unlocked something inside Kira that had been frozen for far too long, and the dragons responded by creating a spectacular display of fire and ice that merged into patterns of stunning beauty. "Excellent decision, Captain," the Empress said as she raised one hand, and the space around them began to shimmer with energy that felt like static electricity mixed with something deeper and more fundamental, as reality itself seemed to bend and twist in response to her will. Before anyone could react, the entire bridge of the horizon lurched and twisted, as if the ship was being grabbed by invisible hands and pulled through dimensions that humans had no names for, and the sensation was like falling and flying simultaneously, while colors that did not exist in normal space flashed across everyone's vision. The journey lasted only seconds, but felt like hours as the crew experienced sensations that their brains struggled to process, because human nervous systems were not designed to perceive travel through whatever method the Empress used to move between locations instantaneously, and several crew members fell to their knees from disorientation. When the sensation stopped and normal space reasserted itself, the view screen showed something that made every human gasp in wonder and shock, because they were no longer in deep space but orbiting a planet that seemed too beautiful to be real, as if someone had taken every perfect landscape from Earth and combined them into one impossible world. "Welcome to Avaloria," the Empress said with obvious pride in her voice as she gestured toward the view screen where her homeworld spun slowly, showing continents covered in forests that glowed with bioluminescent light and oceans that sparkled with colors ranging from deep purple to bright silver under the light of 3 suns. Cities built from crystal and living metal dotted the landscape, connected by bridges of light that arced through the sky. And at the North Pole stood a palace so massive and intricate that it looked like a mountain range, sculpted by artists who had unlimited time and resources to perfect every detail. Maya checked her sensors and reported in an awed voice that the planet's atmosphere was breathable for humans, and the temperature was perfectly comfortable across most of the surface, as if the entire world had been engineered for ideal living conditions rather than formed by natural geological processes. Troy studied the tactical readings and noticed that the planet was defended by orbital platforms that made Earth's most advanced military satellites look like children's toys, and there were energy signatures throughout the system that suggested weapons powerful enough to destroy invasion fleets before they could even approach the planet. The Empress waved her hand dismissively at the defensive systems and explained that such precautions were necessary because many species had tried to conquer Avaloria over the centuries, drawn by its beauty and resources, but all had failed because Kira protected her home with absolute determination and overwhelming force. She offered to give the crew a tour of the palace where they could rest and eat, while she considered the details of a potential alliance between their peoples, and the invitation was delivered in a tone that made it clear this was not really optional. But at least the Empress was being polite about her expectations. Lauren agreed immediately, because arguing with someone who had just demonstrated the ability to teleport an entire ship across vast distances seemed pointless, and besides, she was genuinely curious about the Empress's home and culture after hearing stories that painted Kira as nothing but a destroyer who cared only for power. The Empress touched a control on her armor, and suddenly the entire crew was transported from the Horizons Bridge to a massive hall inside the palace, where columns of pure crystal rose hundreds of meters to support a ceiling decorated with images of battles and celebrations from across Kira's long history. The dragons materialized in their full physical forms, and their true size became apparent as Ember stretched wings that could have covered a football field, while Frost's crystalline scales reflected light in patterns that created rainbows across the polished floor, and both creatures moved with grace that seemed impossible for being so large. Servants appeared from side passages, and these were elves like the Empress, but without her overwhelming presence, as they moved efficiently to prepare refreshments and accommodations for the unexpected guests, while casting curious glances at the humans who looked both amazed and terrified by their surroundings. The Empress led them through corridors decorated with art and artifacts from dozens of alien cultures that Kira had encountered over her long life, and she explained the history of each piece with genuine enthusiasm, as if she rarely had the opportunity to share her collections with anyone who might appreciate them. They passed through gardens where plants from different worlds grew together in combinations that should have been impossible, because the species required different atmospheres and temperatures, but somehow thrived side by side through technology or magic that human science could not explain. Lauren noticed that despite the palace's size and grandeur, there were signs everywhere of loneliness, as most chambers were empty and unused, while dust covered furniture in rooms that had not seen visitors in years or decades, and the beautiful home felt more like a museum than a place where someone actually lived. The Empress brought them to a dining hall where a table had been prepared with food and drink from multiple worlds, including some dishes that looked remarkably similar to human cuisine, as if Kira had studied Earth's cultures in preparation for this meeting and wanted her guests to feel comfortable. Maya whispered to Lauren that the Empress was trying very hard to be a good host, despite clearly having little practice at entertaining guests, and the observation made the captain realize that Kira's fearsome reputation had probably scared away most potential visitors, leaving her isolated in her magnificent palace. Troy remained alert despite the comfortable surroundings, because he understood that danger could come from anywhere in this strange place, and his training would not allow him to relax completely, even though the Empress had shown no hostile intentions since bringing them to Avaloria. The crew sat at the table and began eating carefully while the Empress watched them with obvious interest, as if their simple actions of choosing food and conversing quietly were fascinating to someone who had not shared a meal with equals in longer than she cared to remember. Kira explained that she had been watching humanity for decades since Earth first achieved spaceflight, and she had intervened secretly several times to protect human colonies from alien threats that would have destroyed them before humanity even knew danger existed. She revealed that a species called the Krell had planned to invade Earth 20 years ago with a fleet that would have overwhelmed human defenses, but the Empress had destroyed that fleet in deep space and warned the Krell that humanity was under her protection without ever revealing her actions to the humans themselves. Lauren felt shock and gratitude mixed together as she realized that humanity owed its continued existence to this woman, who everyone thought was just a threat to be avoided, and the revelation changed her entire perspective on the Empress and her motivations. The Empress continued explaining that she had protected humanity not because she expected gratitude or payment, but because she saw potential in the human species to become something unique in a galaxy full of predators and prey who thought only in terms of conquest or submission. Kira stood from the table and walked to a massive window that overlooked her capital city, where millions of her people lived in peace protected by her power, and she spoke about the burden of being responsible for so many lives while having no one to share that weight with because everyone saw her as invincible. The Empress explained that she had been alone for most of her 300 years because other rulers either feared her strength or tried to use her for their own ambitions, and genuine friendship was impossible when everyone wanted something from her or was too terrified to speak honestly in her presence. Lauren listened carefully and began to understand that the Empress's test on the horizon had been about finding someone who could see past the legend to the person underneath all the power and weapons, and that her bold responses had given Kira hope that humans might be different from the countless species who had disappointed her before. The captain stood and walked to join the Empress at the window, and she spoke quietly about humanity's own history of loneliness when they thought they were alone in the universe, and how that isolation had shaped their desire to reach out and connect with others, even when it was dangerous. She explained that humans had learned through painful experience that isolation was a poison that destroyed civilizations from within, and that the strongest communities were built on trust and mutual support, rather than fear and domination. Even though those lessons had cost countless lives to learn, the Empress turned to look at Lauren, and her violet eyes held tears that she did not try to hide, as if the simple act of being understood by another being was overwhelming after centuries of isolation, at the peak of power where no one dared approach her as an equal. Ember and Frost moved closer to their mistress, and the dragons wrapped their massive forms around Kira in a gesture of comfort that showed these ancient creatures were more than just weapons or servants, but true companions who shared her loneliness and understood her pain in ways no other being could. Maya and Troy exchanged glances across the dining table as they witnessed this moment of vulnerability from the deadliest warrior in known space, and they began to understand that their captain had somehow managed to accomplish something that seemed impossible by making an emotional connection with someone who everyone else only saw as a threat. The Empress wiped her eyes and laughed softly at herself for showing such weakness in front of strangers. But Lauren quickly corrected her, saying that sharing honest emotions was not weakness, but the greatest strength any being could possess, because it meant having the courage to be vulnerable when vulnerability could lead to harm. Kira smiled at this response, and she made a decision that would change the course of galactic history, as she formally proposed an alliance between her empire and humanity, with terms that were far more generous than anyone had expected, because she valued the connection she felt with these strange, fragile beings who spoke truth to power. The Empress explained that she would provide humanity with technology and protection from hostile species, in exchange for nothing more than honest friendship and the opportunity to visit Earth and experience human culture firsthand, because she was tired of being alone at the top and wanted companions who saw her as more than just power. Lauren felt the weight of this moment, as she realized that accepting the Empress's offer would transform humanity's position in the galaxy overnight, from vulnerable newcomers to protected allies of the most powerful ruler in known space. But it would also mean taking responsibility for that friendship and everything it implied. The captain looked at her crew and saw agreement in their eyes, because they understood that this opportunity might never come again, and that the Empress was offering not just military alliance, but genuine connection between their peoples built on mutual respect and understanding. She accepted the Empress's terms and sealed the alliance with a handshake that felt almost absurdly simple, for an agreement that would reshape galactic politics. But sometimes the most important moments were marked by simple human gestures rather than elaborate ceremonies. Kira pulled Lauren into an embrace that surprised everyone, including the captain herself, and the Empress whispered, "Thank you," in a voice that shook with emotion, because for the first time in centuries, she felt hope that she might have found beings who could accept her for who she was rather than what she could do. The dragons roared with joy, and their combined voices shook the palace, while Ember breathed flames that formed shapes of celebration, and Frost created ice sculptures that depicted humans and elves standing together as equals, united by friendship rather than divided by fear. The Empress's servants rushed into the hall, alarmed by the noise, but stopped in shock when they saw their mistress embracing a human and smiling with genuine happiness, because none of them could remember the last time Kira had shown such open emotion or allowed anyone to get close enough for physical contact. Over the following weeks, the crew of the Horizon remained on Avaloria as honored guests, while the Empress personally taught them about her empire's technology and history, and she listened with equal interest to their stories about Earth and human culture, as if every detail was precious. Lauren and Kira spent hours each day in conversation, covering topics ranging from military strategy to philosophy, to simple discussions about favorite foods and childhood memories, and the Empress seemed to blossom under the attention of someone who genuinely wanted to know her as a person. Maya became fascinated by the Empress's communication systems and worked with elven engineers, to establish a direct link between Earth and Avaloria that would allow instant communication across the vast distances separating their worlds, and the technical collaboration built bridges of understanding between the two species. Troy trained with the Empress's military forces and gained respect from elven warriors who initially doubted that humans could contribute anything meaningful to their already overwhelming combat capabilities. But his tactical insights and creative thinking impressed even the most skeptical veterans. The dragons adopted the human crew as their own, and Ember enjoyed teaching them about fire magic, while Frost showed them how ice crystals could be used for everything from communication to construction, and the ancient creatures seemed delighted to have new students after centuries of teaching only elves. When the time came for the crew to return to Earth and report their success, the farewell was bittersweet because genuine friendships had formed during their stay, and the Empress looked sad to see them go even though she knew they would return soon. Kira presented Lauren with a personal gift, which was a small crystal that contained a direct communication link to the Empress herself, bypassing all official channels so the two leaders could speak privately whenever needed, and the gesture showed the depth of trust and affection that had developed between them. The Empress promised to visit Earth within a month to meet with human leaders and begin formal diplomatic relations, but more importantly, to experience Lauren's homeworld and understand the culture that had produced someone capable of seeing past her fearsome reputation to the lonely person underneath. The crew of the Horizon returned home as heroes who had accomplished what everyone thought was impossible by not only making contact with Empress Kira Nightshade, but establishing a genuine alliance based on friendship and mutual respect that would protect humanity for generations to come. Lauren's final report to Earth Command emphasized that the Empress was not a threat to be feared but a potential friend who had been waiting centuries for someone brave enough to approach her with honesty and respect, and that humanity's greatest strength was not weapons or technology but the courage to reach out and make connections. The alliance between humanity and the Empress's empire transformed galactic politics, as other species realized that humans were now under the protection of the most powerful warrior. In known space, and many civilizations that had ignored or threatened humanity now sought diplomatic relations and trade agreements. But the most important change was personal, as Empress Kira Nightshade finally found what centuries of victory and power could never provide, which was genuine friendship with beings who valued her for herself, rather than what she could do for them. And the deadliest warrior in the galaxy discovered that the greatest victory was not conquest but connection.